Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Education Matters with Jim O'Connell. I appreciate your time. We're here on coming up to the end of May, and and the school year is coming close to an end. So let me just. We won't be joined by a friend tonight, so there we go. So we're up to the end of May, and June 1st coming on Wednesday, and no, Thursday, I think, right? We'll give it another day. Yes, Wednesday is the 31st. So at the end of the school year, it's an exciting time for lots of people. High school graduations are on this Wednesday. I'm sorry, on this Saturday. I think it starts with MST, and then I think Central is next. And I have a son graduating Central High School, so the O'Connells will be part of the celebration this year. Actually, in our house, we'll have another one next year, so it's going to be exciting times, God willing. But anyway, congratulations to all the young people in the city who have spent how many years with us? I guess what is it, about 13 or something years in our school system, and for good or for ill, here they are out the far end of it. I say this to people all the time, and for those of you with little kids I was talking to a lady today with a kid who's just finishing kindergarten, and everybody says this, but it's just so true, which is that it all goes by so fast. One minute they're toddlers, next minute they're kids, then they're tweens, and teenagers, and the next thing you know, they're out of there. So anyway, congratulations on all of that. In the background to all of this, we have our budget issue that goes on. If anybody would like to call in on the budget issue or other issues, please feel free to do so. Our number is 640-3091. That's 640-3091. And that's if you're here live watching on Tuesday afternoon at 6 o'clock. So the budget wars go on, and we'll go back to those in a minute. We're just coming off of a very important weekend, Memorial Day weekend, and I just think I didn't get an opportunity to do it last week, so I just want to acknowledge the fact that it is Memorial Day weekend, and as I mentioned on this show last week, I am a bit of a history buff, and it's impossible to well, I guess maybe it's possible, but for me, it's impossible to read history without reliving the lives of the men and women, mostly men, given the historical nature of this, who have given the ultimate sacrifice for their nation over the years. So I'm always very aware of that, and I think oftentimes we remember the most recent war. So, and rightfully so, perhaps the people who live amongst us are those who went and fought in Iraq, or the Gold Star families who have lost sons and daughters in Iraq or Afghanistan or in other places. But the people who fought in World War II. It's called the Greatest Generation. I think there's an argument can be made for that. I think the people who fought in World War I were a great generation too, and the people who fought in Korea were a great generation, etc. I think the people who fought in Vietnam, it's not their fault that that a war is not as decisive or is not as clear-cut or etc., as some other wars are. You could make the argument that the Second World War, that our interpretation of it is more simplistic than the reality. But I don't want to get into the niceties of this in some kind of treatise on history. I do want to say that somebody, a lady watching this show now or watching TV tonight in Manchester, whose brother, somebody of 80 or 90, whose brother was lost in Korea or in World War II. For them, the losses is real today when they look at that brown faded photograph on the mantelpiece of a son, a brother, an uncle who was lost early, and there are people. I'm old enough to remember people who had fought in World War One, and just there's a whole there are people in this country who are affected by this, and then there's the vast majority, of course, who are not. And I'm not suggesting that that should change and everybody should be militarized and somehow that as a nation we I don't support these ideas that the world has gone to pot when we got rid of the draft or something. I'm not arguing any of that. I'm just saying that on moments like Memorial Day, it's important for all of us, but especially I think children and people as they're being educated through our education system to stop and take a breath and to understand the reality, the cost of that which we have. I think sometimes it gets lost in the ballyhoo. I was watching the Memorial Evening concert from Washington it was on Sunday night live on PBS, and it's repeated a number of times, but it's always carried on PBS, and it was Gary Sinise and somebody else who led that. But it's a wonderful, it's only an hour and a half or 2 hours, and it seems to me that it should almost be compulsory viewing for everybody, because it goes back and looks, it has veterans there from our various wars, etc. So anyway, I just want to make the point strongly that not alone is this an important date, it should be recognized. We ought to recognize those people around us who have had great loss, and it should never go unspoken. And I, for one, in my little way on this little show, never want these days to go by without they being recognized. And as it's important to recognize, as I said at this time last year, there are 3 days when we recognize the contribution of our armed forces. And Armed Forces Day is the day on which we recognize those currently serving, from Coast Guard to Marines to Army, Navy, and Air Force. That's Armed Forces Day. And some people get these muddled up a little bit, but it's a pretty simple concept. Armed Forces Day is for currently serving members of our armed forces. Veterans Day, when we celebrate that, we're celebrating all the veterans from all our wars who have come back either whole or in part, wounded or not, have come back from wars. They are the veterans who served. And then Memorial Day, which to me is the most sacrosanct of them all. I've been fortunate in that I've been able to travel a lot in my life, and I visited the what you'd call the killing fields of France, and I visited the graves both of the First World War and of the Second World War in places like Normandy or Ypres or the other World War One battles. And again, Arlington Cemetery, which many of you may have been to, is a very moving and emotional place. But one that I found particularly moving, probably second to Arlington Cemetery, is the Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. And when people go to Hawaii, a lot of people, it's a big tourist destination to go to the Arizona Memorial on the west side of Oahu in Pearl City, in Pearl Harbor. And that's very popular. But if you go to the eastern side of Oahu, of Honolulu, there in these rolling hills overlooking the Pacific, there are the countless white crosses of the Cemetery of the Pacific, and the serenity of that place, and given the sort of tropical or Pacific Island nature of the site, looking out in the distance at the ocean, it is a very moving place. So I suggest to anybody who finds themselves at some time in the future making it out to Hawaii to not avoid or not take the opportunity to visit the Cemetery of the Pacific. So that's my little piece for Memorial Day. I'm very conscious of the fact that we live in a country that is built upon the shoulders of those who went before us, and in particularly those who fought and died for not just some jingoistic version of our freedom, but for our for our nation as it is today, and that means everybody in our nation, because I make that very inclusive. And I don't want to be controversial about this, but I think if you choose to wear flags and lapel on your lapel, and if you choose to fly flags, then good for you. That is perfectly fine. I think if you're wearing a flag on your lapel and you look at the guy alongside you on the bus or in the line at the supermarket and he doesn't have a flag on his lapel, try to not feel better than he is or more patriotic than he is, because that's not necessarily the case. So that's it with Memorial Day. Back to education. I have to tell you, as we move forward, we find ourselves still budgetless. The plan as it's on the table today looks as though we're going to lose our 14, we have RIFT, a reduction in force. We've eliminated 14 teachers, and we're not going to hire a further 28. And that's a net loss of 42 teachers in our city, a loss that we can ill afford. And hopefully, on next Tuesday night, there is a date certain coming when a budget will have to be adopted, and that will be next Tuesday night. And barring a if it is not done then what will happen is that the mayor's budget will by default become the city budget, and that default budget would fund our schools at 165 million. That would cement these losses in place. It would eliminate programs and teachers, and nothing would be. There would be no replacement, and etc. And that would be a pretty awful scenario for the young people of our city, and an awful scenario for our city. If, however, a budget, which is most likely to happen, I think, that some budget is proposed, that the mayor may choose to veto, and in that case there's an additional 2 weeks allowed, which would get us to the end of June. So it's a little complicated, but if there is a proposed and passed, if there is a budget other than the mayor's budget that's passed by the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, and then if it doesn't reach the number 10, which is what's required to override the mayor's proposed possible veto, and if the mayor were to veto it, then the whole thing is put off for 2 weeks, and if not resolved during that 2 week period, again the default budget becomes the budget. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you, since I know in recent weeks and as we've been talking about the budget, I have grown. My emotions have changed quite a bit as we've been talking about this, because I've become aware that I am like a I don't know, like a voice in the wilderness, to use a biblical term, that I'm just not being listened to. And on our program last week, I asked about this question about if we have people going before the school board and before the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, and they're saying that these cuts are a step too far and that we want them undone, and people are saying that they would like to see the schools properly funded, and yet there is no response from our political leadership. My question last week was, well, why is that so? And I was surmising, was there an invisible force acting in the opposite direction? And of course, we know that wealth means access, and that's just sort of the way the world works and the way the world rolls. Democracy is meant to do something to alleviate that problem, so that not just the powerful have a say in any society, but that the least amongst us have a say too. That universal suffrage, the right of everybody over the age of 18 who is a citizen and qualified to vote, should be allowed to vote, and actually should vote, and their voice should be heard, and that people would have equal voice. And sadly, in the United States today, of course, we all know that that's not quite the case. I think in any society it's not quite the case. It's always true that I think the friends of those who are in office or the most powerful people in any city, some person who's got great influence over the city's economy. I think back to, probably in 1900 in the city of Manchester, if the chairman of the board of the Amaskeg Manufacturing Company were to make maybe not quite a phone call in 1900, although it would have been possible, but if he were to have a word in the ear of an alderman or mayor, I think that clearly carries more weight than somebody working in the mill carries. And that's just the nature of the way the world is. But our democracy is meant to try to level that playing field so we all have equal access. Well, in Manchester, when I hear people speaking out and asking our political leadership to stop reducing the funding of our schools, as I pointed out last week, I think there are forces in our city that are not in the public domain who don't speak at public meetings, who are not to be heard in the public discourse, but privately have back-channel communication and open communication with people like the mayor and aldermen and others, but have access to the corner office and make their feelings known. And we know whether they just maybe they're happy to get the benefit of low taxes in the low property taxes in the city, and be happy to be able to continue to build their condominium units and etc. And do so at a cost less than what it's costing the city. So maybe they're just happy to do it, or maybe they do apply pressure one way or the other. We do know that two of the largest property developers in the state of New Hampshire contributed inordinate amounts of money to Mayor Gatsas as he was running for governor the last time. Something in the order between two companies, as I recall, something in the order of $500,000 or $600,000. Which could only be done, of course, because the advantage was taken of this loophole where LLCs, limited liability companies, or like usually LLCs were like law firms or partnerships, and then you had C corporations, etc., that were not like businesses. Well, LLCs are set up nowadays for, if I were to have a portfolio of properties, I might have an LLC for each one, and so because each one of these LLCs can give up to whatever that number is, $1,500 per candidate or something, or it might be $5,000 a candidate. I'm not an election funding guy, so I don't really know, and I don't really care to find out. But it did allow, this loophole allowed two companies, basically two individuals and their corporations, to contribute a huge amount of money to Mayor Gatsas in his failed run for governor. And so I guess, he who pays the piper, gets to call the tune. I'm not saying there's anything untoward going on here. I'm not saying there's anything illegal going on here. And I'm not saying that because I'm afraid to say it. I'm not saying that because I don't think they need to go to the point of doing anything illegal or wrong. I think they simply use pull the levers that they have sitting in front of them. But clearly, they have a voice louder than you and I have, because they are getting their way in the end in the city of Manchester. As I thought about this during the past week, I've thought some more about it, and I'm saying, well, that's one possible scenario. So reaching out to some of the politicians in the city, it becomes obvious that actually, I am a voice in the wilderness, because I'm just not being heard. And an alderman said to me some weeks ago that, Jim, when you come before the school board or the board mayor and alderman, the problem is that people like close their ears because they kind of heard your shtick, and that's fine, but there's nothing they can do about it, so they move on to the next thing. And I think actually that person was probably very correct. and so it is true that they just don't hear me. And then I was listening to Alderman Pat Long, whose heart's in the right place. Alderman Pat Long was speaking on this channel last week, and he mentioned me, and he said, you know, what I think I'd called into a show that he was on, and he said, you know, the problem is what Jim O'Connell needs to do is he needs to come forward with proposals to actually, you know, how we move forward, and he needs to come forward, and this is the key piece, that Jim O'Connell needs to come forward with realistic steps forward, things we could actually do. In other words, small things that we could do that would improve things. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the nub of the problem right there. Because this is not a screed or you know to malign Pat Long, but when I listen to what Pat Long has to say, what he's really saying is that he doesn't wish to recognize the structural problem in our schools, that our schools are woefully underfunded. And so he's playing within the fold, within the confines of the box, to solve the problem based on the box that he's been placed in. And I'm saying blow up the box. So there's a significant disconnect. Another disconnect that I have recognized again is I was listening to Alderman Barbara Shaw talking about the schools, and she said that she won't vote to override the tax cap unless she hears from her constituents, and she feels that her constituents are maybe I'm putting words in her mouth, but it seemed to me what she was saying is that her constituency, her constituents are elderly and poor with single incomes and can't afford any more than they're paying right now. And so in her case, though, she said that the Board of Mayor and Aldermen had been, I don't know what the exact words were, I'd have to look them up, but basically sort of, you know, been throwing money at the schools for years, and that it was a perpetual problem. We kept on throwing money at the schools. And, you know, she is simply incorrect. I mean, she's not in command of her facts, and I'm not being argumentative. My point is, once again, we have not been throwing money at the schools. We have never given the schools the money that they actually need. What has been happening is that we've had a perpetual discussion going on around cutting in our schools, and we get to a point of ridiculousness when we comes to cuts, and we offer, you know, $1 million extra or $2 million extra. I'm even saying it now. I'm buying into it, but we offer $2 million more than what we were originally going to give them, which was not enough. And at the end of the following year, we're like, well, we gave you $2 million extra last year. So we're talking past each other. That's my point. I'm at a loss to know how to proceed, because it's not. There are those who just don't want to listen anyway. They're sort of, you know, they're argumentative in nature, often not in command of their facts, have no interest in actually debating something and reaching a conclusion, but rather want to sort of shout by you. And I can think of one or two in particular that it's sort of a waste of time engaging with them, because their worldview is ideological, and the facts won't shift them away from their position. So my stance is a pretty simple one. In the city of Manchester, we're spending less per student than everybody else, and we need to find a way of solving that problem. We need to find additional sources. First of all, we have to agree that that's the case, and that's the most frustrating thing of all. That's my allusion to Alderman Pat Long, or to in a different way to Alderman Barbara Shaw, because both of them, one of them saying yes, but Jim, we gotta like find something small we can achieve, because we're not going to be able to achieve the big thing, and I'm saying why not. And then I have Alderman Barbara Shaw saying that basically, on the one hand, we can't afford it, which isn't true, because we can, and the figures show we can. And on the other hand, that, well, we've been throwing money at the schools and it hasn't worked, which the figures prove is not true either, because we have not been. And then you go out onto social media, and social media is like a disaster when it comes to this topic, because you have people repeating, outright lies, half truths, half baked truths, and there are very few people there who are obviously, telling just mistruths and firing them out, and not caring. Most of them are. Sorry, I'm getting hit with multiple texts over here. Please feel free to call in at 640-3091. I'd be happy to talk to them. But most people are just simply misinformed. They say things that they talk about the reduction in students in the city, and that we've got declining populations, and therefore that's the reason why we have to reduce teachers, and that's a very reasonable stance. And why are these? And then they get into these attacks about liberals and leftists and spendthrifts and people robbing my money and all that stuff, and it's kind of very unhelpful. But the fact is that that just simply doesn't bear scrutiny. Yes, we've had a reduction in our schools for two reasons, perhaps three. We have had our sending towns that we fired out of here and threw out, and that just made no sense whatsoever. But the many who supported that stance for years are now silent on the topic, because for years their only fig leaf to hide behind in Manchester was to say that it was the contributing towns that were the cause of the problem, and once they were gone we'd be fine, and they're gone and we're not fine. So one of the issues is that they've been eliminated, and so we've had a reduction in students in our. That only applies to high schools, because we had no contributing towns coming to our grade schools or middle schools. And then secondly, we've had a reduction because of a decreased population in the city of Manchester, and more broadly in the state, an issue of great concern. And then thirdly, because of the difficulties in our schools, we've had the growth of what was originally parochial schools or Catholic schools, and now we have charter schools, private schools. We've got homeschooling. We've got a whole plethora of choices for people. So we have a significant number of kids who are out of our school system for those reasons, and then the ones who have left. But when all of that is said and done, the fact is that we have the highest pupil-teacher ratios in the state, and this is my problem with getting rid of the 50. I understand, or the 42. I understand if there's a need to right-size the high schools, I would be much more benevolent in my response to it. If Dr. Vargas was saying we're riffing 14 teachers out of MST in our high schools. Like it or not, MST is having declining numbers for whatever reason. It's the subject for another show, perhaps. But with declining numbers in MST, perhaps you have to eliminate, I think it's 6 or 8 staff over there. Maybe it was 8, and it was 8 people out of that school, which for that school is traumatic. But if he was saying, we're reducing this 14 in force, because what we're going to do is we're going to hire 14 teachers into our grade schools, and we will, at least in some of the grades, all those grades that I spent a month ago reading out, where we had grade after grade after grade after grade in our schools with 30 kids per class in grade school classes, 3rd and 4th and 5th grades with 30 kids per class in it. And as I pointed out in a very simple way, that exercise that I did here on this show, and I tried to do it in front of the mayor and alderman, that threw up an immediate need for 21 teachers to solve the problems in the classes that I named. That was the classic model of, we've got 3 classes with, let's say, a 5th grade class in one of our grade schools. We have 3 classes of 30. And this actual number occurred again and again. Sometimes it was 29 and 30, or 28 and 29. But this number 30 occurred again and again, and it was clear as day that instead of having 3 30s, you would take that 90, you would divide it by 4, and you would have 2 classes of 23 and 2 classes of 22, and that meant hiring 1 new teacher in that school. So it's very simplistically, without looking at all the additional programs that we've eliminated and haven't been funded over the years, just to solve the too large class size in our grade schools, we needed 21 grade school teachers just to solve the worst of the problems. So just to get rid of the 30s and the 29s and the 31s, we needed to get to that number. So that was 21 hires. So that's my problem, ladies and gentlemen. I'm trying not to be unreasonable when I respond in the way I do to the elimination of 42 staff, teachers, that is 28 retiring, not being hired, and 14 being fired in a school district that is already doesn't have enough teachers for its kids. And so, Dr. Vargas may not have liked it when I talked about his notion of right-sizing the district being CEO speak, because it's CEO speak, yes, but it's also an excuse when you're only right-siding on one side of the equation. It reminds me when people want, they talk about education and other political matters, and people talk about there ought to be local control. So many of my friends on the conservative side of the ledger will argue in favour of local control. Yet those very same people, and they seem sincere in that belief, but those very same people are up in Concord 3 or 4 years ago under Bill O'Brien, and they want to step in to the city of to the town of Bedford and force the town of Bedford to give up its IB program, its International Baccalaureate program, because they didn't like that, this was some, whatever their nonsense thoughts are, and I'm sorry to be derogatory about it, but it's just ridiculous that there's some sort of pinky regime, teaching, McCarthy-esque fashion, teaching, internationalism and communism to our kids in Bedford. I got to tell you, if you look at the body politic in Bedford and the people who represent Bedford at the state level, they're a pretty conservative bunch. Some would say very conservative. So the idea that Bedford would be the hotbed of internationalism, etc., would be stepping a bit far. So here's this example of, let's go to local. It's all about local control, local control, local control, except when they don't like what local control throws up, and then all of a sudden we're going to have state control. And we have the exact same thing happens when they talk about this should go to the states, except for when they don't like it, and then they want it to go to national. So I have very little time for that argument, because I see it being used as an excuse to not take action in the city of Manchester. So ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, where do we stand? I think as we head into school year 2017-2018, we come off a year in Manchester where our schools and our students have had extraordinary success. We've talked about the awards that have been won by our students, the national recognition that our MST this past week had national recognition from public television. We've had national recognition for numerous students and for our schools. So lots of great things. We've turned out a great body of students again, and lots of great things happening in our schools. But ladies and gentlemen, the stuff that's not happening and the challenges that continue to mount up, it's daunting and it's frightening to see that it goes on, and that our political leadership is willfully ignorant of where it is. We're going to be arguing next Tuesday for the budget to add $2 million to the budget, so we go from 165, which is what the mayor's budget is, which is less than level funding in actual dollars. That we would find this extra $2 million that the other alderman would find, get 10 votes to override the tax cap, or the mayor's budget at least, and even maybe it can be done without going over the tax cap, but finding $2 additional million, so we get to 167. And if we get to that 167, what Dr. Vargas is proposing is that we do a number of things, that we eliminate, the SROs that we've eliminated, that's the resource officers, be replaced in our schools because it's important. He also proposes that we reintroduce languages to our middle schools, and then some of that $2 million will go towards alleviating some of the overcrowding in our grade schools. But that's if we get the additional $2 million. Remember, what our schools require just to retain the programs that they have in place today is $170 million. That's what level funding is in real terms. And in the city of Manchester, we're going to argue 165 or 167. If we get to 165, God help us all. I don't know. I know it's just a matter of which faces and which kids, because I know the kids are going to be seriously affected because of it. If we get to 167, with all due respects to Alderman Shaw, but Alderman Shaw and others like her will be saying, "Oh, we gave additional $2 million to the school last year, and what do we get?" And she just simply is just mistaken in her view. It's not $2 million extra dollars. The $2 million that everybody's looking to get. So I think people like that group of people around like Mr. Kavanagh and Pat Long probably leading this, and the others who are going to try and find that additional $2 million. They'll be very pleased if they do it, and I'll be happy for them that they find the extra $2 million. But in the end, it won't bring back. It won't bring back any of the 42 staff that we're eliminating. It will bring some new people in, which would be a good thing. So, but I don't know what's going to happen with those programs where we're eliminating people from, and none of the programs that were eliminated in the past, none of the remedial programs for kids, none of the additional time that we took away from kids and English language learners and from English language and reading in our middle schools, our Read 180 program, our PASS program, none of those things are going to be reinstated. Our programs that we had in place for people who needed to make up grades at the end of their high school career, so they could sit to help them. Kids who find their way suddenly, they at 14 or 15 they rebel, and they get to be 16 or 17. They see the outcome as it's about to come down the tracks at them, and they're saying, "Here I am facing graduation. What should I do?" So they seek to make up their grades, and we had a program that could assist them in doing that, and that program, none of those programs will be funded. So I'm an optimist usually, ladies and gentlemen, but as I look at the quandary that we're in as a city right now, and I look at the political leadership that we have in place. And in my mind, by the way, I contemplate what a future in the city would look like if we have a change in the corner office. And I don't know whether Mayor Gatsis intends to run or not. I mean, I'd be amazed if he does, but the tea leaves are starting to read like he probably will. But if there is a change in the corner office, and if Joyce Craig is that change, I try to put myself in Joyce Craig's shoes, and I say, Joyce Craig coming into office in the city of Manchester in the end of 2017. Or the beginning of 2018, and if she has to deal with the set of characters sitting around the table as they are today, and I don't mean that to sound derogatory when I say the set of characters, there is no political will there to move this city forward. We have I don't know how to say this without making people feel as though I'm being unkind to them, because I don't want to be, but the word that comes to mind to me is small-minded. They're small-minded in their view. They don't have a vision for a vibrant future for the city of Manchester. They certainly have no understanding that the biggest single problem facing Manchester is its education system. It's also the biggest problem facing the state, by the way. Just as a little sidebar here, we have the proposal that has come out of Concord for the budget for the biennium for the next 2 years is to level fund the university system. We already have the most expensive university system in the United States. I was talking to somebody the other day who said that if you're an in-state student and you go to, it was either North Carolina, I think it might have been North Carolina or maybe it was I think it was the university system of North Carolina. If you're an in-state student, the annual cost is $8,000. Um, wow, with a couple of Pell Grants, which of course President Trump and Secretary DeVos would like to eliminate. Um, but at $8,000, who wouldn't be happy with that? But instead, we're going to level fund our state universities once again, and so for the next 2 years, whatever increased cost, be that the cost of toilet paper, sausages for the dinners, or carpet shampoo for the carpets, whatever they're paying money on every week, gasoline for their trucks. Whatever that goes up, the state of New Hampshire is saying to the college system, tough luck. Why don't you eat that up? So I don't understand what our political leadership in the state and in the city don't see about the need to adequately fund our education. And in the end, folks, I guess it comes up to you, right? It's what you, the people of Manchester, decide, and what the people of the state of New Hampshire decide. You could send anybody you want to Concord. You just have been choosing to send people who don't value education. It it just doesn't make any sense. If you wanted to turn this state, I was going to say turn the state around. The state is already doing well financially, but if you wanted to really grow the economy in the state of New Hampshire at a robust pace, the easiest way to do it today would be to spend money on education, because you could do something about the declining population trend in the state. You could attract young people with families. Clearly, demographically, this is a significant problem. It's a problem for having companies come here and grow. When Oracle comes in and purchases Dyn, they had hundreds or 800, if not hundreds, of recs open, of requisitions for jobs open that they could not fill, and yet as Manchester goes, so goes the state of New Hampshire, and the city of Manchester. We refuse to fund our schools properly. Given the number of people who do come in to the towns and cities around Manchester, those populations grow, because when people come in and they go on Truya or Zillow or whatever, and they look at things like per pupil expenditure, or they look at class sizes, and they see that Manchester gets the lowest scores of anybody in the state, and of course they vote with their feet and they go someplace else. So sitting in the corner office and shouting louder and louder and louder that everything's fine, and we're doing fine with education. Look at the great education we have. It's not working. It hasn't worked for Mayor Gatsis for 8 years. At the outset, he seems like a smart enough guy. I don't understand what he doesn't get. I mean, the answer is as plain as the nose on his face. What he's been doing has not been working. I've said to him for 8 years, you need to turn around to the people of Manchester and tell them that we need to fund our schools adequately. And he has no interest in doing such a thing. And frankly, it's because he really doesn't believe in himself. And he's happy to have inherited a set of schools and school buildings and an infrastructure that he's overseen the downsizing of, and it seems that he's a lot better at that than he is at anything else. And, I guess I don't want this to turn into an anti-Ted Gatsis thing. It's nothing personal, but it's just his style of leadership. There are CEOs who come into companies, and their main task is to right-size them, downsize them, and or to break them up so that the investors can maximize profit. And you'll see this done all the time, right? We'll see large finance houses, and they will acquire a company in order to break it up into its constituent parts, and they can make the most money by selling off the constituent parts, and they do that, and they walk away with a handsome profit. And often, of course, as we all know, there are a lot of workers and employees left without jobs at the end of it, and seemingly that's a model that works for some. It certainly works for those who've got the money to indulge in it. And here in the city of Manchester, I don't know what Mayor Gatsis' plan was when he took the gavel from the previous mayor, but. But clearly, he has overseen the downsizing of the schools with the elimination of the towns, and we've gone from a city that was named by, I think it was Forbes magazine, amongst others, as one of the top places to live in the United States, to a city that has a reputation regionally and even nationally for the quality of its schools, and I think unjustly in many cases the opiate crisis. The opiate crisis is a function of the fact that I'm not denying that there's an opiate crisis. There is, but we had the misfortune to have a presidential primary going on as the opiate crisis was blooming around the country, and sadly Manchester had 30 television trucks parked up and down Elm Street whose crews and reporters and producers had spare time, and so they went off to cover the story du jour, the story of the day, and the story of the day in Manchester was a burgeoning opiate problem. So not to deny there's an opiate problem, but I think we were ill-served by the fact that of the timing of the surge in the opiate crisis, and the fact that sort of the news media was here. And that's not to blame the news media. It's just a function of timing. I've said before, and I say it here, that when people look at the opiate crisis today, I don't think they look at Manchester and say, oh, Manchester is ground central for the opiate crisis, because most people have seen it in their own families. It's touched their own communities. And, on the furthest mountaintops of the state of New Hampshire, people have found themselves affected at a very local level by the opiate crisis. So, in one sense, as I've said before, that issue, as a solely Manchester issue, doesn't have the same stigma as it had previously because of this fact that it's common to everybody. However, on the school side, we have no plan in place to offer up to people a compelling reason why they should send their kids to the city of Manchester. And when I said this to Pat Long on a show the other day, and I think he took a little umbrage at it and talked about all the great things that were happening in Manchester, and it makes me feel bad because I agree about all the great things that are happening in the city of Manchester. But my point to Pat Long last Wednesday night when I asked him that question was, I have two kids right now in Central High School, one a junior and one a freshman, who are in math classes of 31 and 32. And I said to him, you're about to eliminate 42 teachers out of that system, and some of them out of Central. What are you going to do about the 32 and the 31 students in math classes at Central? What's the plan for next year? And the plan is, there is not a plan. And I don't mean to pick out Pat Long. He's one of 14 members of the Board of School Committee, of the Alderman Committee, so it's not his fault. I'm sure if there was a way, he would try to find it, or at least within his limited view of what the way might be. That's where, to me, where the rubber hits the road. We can talk all day around in circles about overrides and tax caps and rates and what we can do and how we can do it. There's my example from the O'Connell family of two kids at Central High School with 32 and 31 kids in their class. I know, because I produced the figures for people 3-4 weeks ago, that this problem was going on in every grade school in the city of Manchester. And the answer from the Board of Mayor and Aldermen is simple. Their answer is they don't have an answer. But what they will not do is what I want them to do, which is to, turn to the cameras in the city of Manchester and tell the people fair and square that we need to do better and we can do better. And I don't know what that is. Obviously, when it comes to property taxes, if that's the only source of revenue, then we're in some difficulty. But in the end, Manchester taxpayers right now are spending less than their compatriots or their fellow citizens of the state in every other town. So there is room on the upside for property taxes for schools. You can deny it all you want, and sort of you can take the Barbara Shaw attitude, which is, my constituents are telling me they can't afford it and all that. Well, frankly, I would say you represent the whole city. You don't just represent, the one street that you're on, or you represent the whole city, and you need to explain to your neighbours what the whole city needs. Because I tell people in my ward all the time who say to me, "Oh, I'm retired now," or "Oh, my kids don't go to school anymore. They're off doing their thing." I'm saying, you live in a city where, you have an obligation to fund the functions of government in the city of Manchester. Just like maybe you don't have a dog that you take for a walk, so then you don't need to pay for someone to, the pooper scooper guy or something. Maybe you've never thrown trash on the streets, so therefore you don't want to pay anybody to clean up Elm Street. Maybe you're never downtown on a Saturday night, so you don't want police details down there making sure everybody's having a good time safely, because wherever you live, you play bridge and ping pong, and you sit around in your house in your slippers. So that's not the way the world works. You're a citizen of the city of Manchester. You support the city of Manchester. And our political leadership needs to have the courage to tell people that what is happening today is not okay. It's not legitimate. It is not fair. And all the facts, and I'm saying all the facts, are clearly pointing all of them in the same direction. There's not, we used to have arguments from people before who could put up arguments in the other direction and say, well, whatever it might be. And those arguments have been taken away from them, other than the most extreme, who would say that we just need to continue to keep cutting our schools, and kids don't need teachers, and teachers are all losers anyway, and put them all on VLAX and computerized learning, and that's the answer to the future. And it's all of it doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't bear scrutiny. It doesn't mean that any one of those things mightn't have value somewhere, but it's not the answer to a school system that simply doesn't have the wherewithal to produce the kids that it needs to produce. And in the end, there are real kids with, beautiful faces looking up at you at the end of the day, if you're a teacher in Manchester or a principal, asking for something that they're not getting. In my world, and I know people might find it emotional language, but in my world, as I used the analogy a few weeks ago, we're back in the Dickensian Oliver Twist, seeking more. And you can hide your face and pretend that that's not happening in the city of Manchester, and that you don't have an obligation to do something about it, because you're allowing that scenario to go on within our city. And I saw a discussion just in the last couple of days. We were talking about fairness and equity. There was a piece on NPR, National New Hampshire Public Radio, actually, I think it was yesterday morning, talking about the challenges to the Manchester School District. And they were talking about, the disparity in between the various schools, and both the disparity of what was supplied to them and the disparity in the needs of the schools. And so we have some schools with much higher levels of poverty, and high levels of English language learners, or high levels of immigrants, or high levels of poverty or unemployment, or people impacted by crime and other social trauma. Some more than others, and sort of the question is raised, then should a school with high levels of those kinds of problems be funded at the same level as a school that doesn't have so many of those problems? That's something that people were debating on social media today, but I've been at pains to point out that when we look out across the state, that we have exactly the same problem on a statewide basis, that it makes no sense that, generally speaking, in the state of New Hampshire, more money is spent on the kids who least need the money spent on them. In other words, if we go to the most exclusive towns in the state of New Hampshire, and even not so exclusive, if we go to the suburbia, where the levels of poverty are lower, and where annual household incomes are higher, etc. In those towns and in those areas, we spend more money on schools, and we spend more money on programs than we do on kids who have exactly the opposite, who have got the least. And just because that's the way the system was designed, and that's the way the system is today, it doesn't make it right. It's actually, if you're a Christian, actually, if you're just if you're somebody who is thoughtful about this and seeks to be fair, it isn't fair at its face. Something ought to be done. The state, the city, and then the state should be ensuring as best it can that there be equal opportunity. We're not even talking about equal outcomes. We're not trying to level outcomes or anything. We're not trying to hold anybody back. We're simply saying it makes no sense in the state of New Hampshire that if you that the more needs you have and the more needy you are, the less will be spent on your education. And the more affluent you are and the more capability you have and the more support you have, the more money we will spend on you, on everything from programs to pupil-teacher ratio, to the quality of your schools, to the beauty of those schools, to the cleanliness of those schools, to the track and the tennis courts and the football fields and the stadiums and the science labs and everything else will all be of a higher quality if you already have more than some of your other fellow citizens, and that's a fundamental problem. But nobody at the state level, and now it's apparent that at the city level, that people want to come back to Jim, come back to us with a small solution for a piece we can bite off that we could do right now. And that's a fundamental problem, because we need some quantum change in this scenario, and the most benevolent people out there are talking about some minor change. So again, we've spent another hour, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you for your time. Hopefully we will reach resolution a week from tonight on next Tuesday. It's likely that we'll have some resolution to the budget. In the meantime, congratulations to everybody graduating this weekend. I hope you all have a great week and stay safe. And we've got 2 more weeks of school and people will be out for the summer. Good night, and thank you very much from Jim O'Connell.